When I was a boy, there was this special air about our home, particularly when the night set in. It wasn't just the crackling fireplace or the wind howling outside, it was the stories. Most of them came from my grandmother. She wasn't just any old woman, she was the last in our family who truly knew our tribe's tales by heart. I remember the way we'd all sit as she started weaving the tales from our past. The room would go quiet save for her voice. She was a bridge between the world we knew and the world that once was. Her words, they weren't just tales, they felt like history handed down, straight from the lips of our ancestors. She believed every word she spoke, and that made us believe too. She used to say, if you forget the past, you lose a piece of yourself. And so, through her stories, she made sure we remembered. Those mountains and rivers weren't just chunks of rock and streams of water to us. They were like the old guardians of our land, watching over us for as long as anyone could remember. I recall my grandmother often pausing, looking out the window and saying, "The mountains listen and the rivers remember." And when she said that, you could almost hear the whispers of ages past echoing through the valleys. That said the mountains and rivers were alive in their own way, that they'd seen generations come and go, had seen love stories, heartbreaks, and battles, and they held those memories deep within. Among the many tales my grandmother shared, the one that always caught our attention was about the whisperers. Sounds mysterious, right? And they truly were. Back in the day, when our land was just beginning to feel the footprints of those first brave settlers, there were these whispers. Not the kind you and I might share secretly, but whispers of tall figures, standing at the edge of the forests, always just out of clear sight. The settlers, they weren't quite sure what to make of them. Some said they were spirits of the land, while others thought they might be guardians of the woods. No one had ever gotten close enough to tell for sure. They'd just appear, like silhouettes against the moonlit night, watching. And then by morning's light, they'd vanish, leaving behind only the faintest traces of their presence. Those early folks weren't fools. They knew not to disturb what they didn't understand, and so instead of confronting these figures, they'd offer respectful nods from a distance, always cautious, always wondering. The whisperers became a part of our land's lore, a mystery that begged questions but offered no clear answers. There's a tale that stands out among the rest. It's about a young girl, no older than my granddaughter. One bright morning, while playing near the forest's edge, she stumbled upon something quite unusual, a series of large, strange footprints, not like any animal and certainly too big to be a man's. Her young heart, filled with courage that children so often have, wouldn't let her just walk away from such a mystery. Instead of running back to the village, as most might have, she decided she'd trace these footprints back to their source. The village, of course, had many tales about those woods, but at that moment, all the warnings and stories were overshadowed by her wondrous spirit. She wanted to see for herself, to know the story behind those footprints, and so with every step, she ventured further away from all that she knew, drawn into the heart of the forest's mystery. After she'd been gone for what seemed like days, she comes wandering back into the village. She started talking about these giants, all covered in hair from head to toe, with hands as big as boulders. We all thought they were just shadows, distant figures to be wary of. But this girl, she told us they were kind, gentle even, fed her when she was hungry, shared their fire when she was cold, and listened when she spoke. She told us how they laughed, a deep rumbling sound that echoed through the trees, and how they had this way of speaking without words, just gestures and deep humming sounds. They cared for her, made sure she was safe, and when she asked to go home, they pointed her in the right direction. After her tale, the village started seeing those giants in a different light. No longer just shadows in the distance, but guardians, maybe even allies. It was a real turning point for our people. Not all stories my grandmother told were heartwarming. Some served as warnings. I remember one about a logger named Tom. Tom wasn't from our village. He came from the city, drawn by tales of rich timber in our forests. With dreams of riches, he set his sights on the oldest trees, not caring or maybe just ignorant about the boundaries set by our ancestors. One day he went deep into the forest, to an area everyone knew to avoid, where the oldest tree stood. That tree, it was said to be sacred to the whisperers, but Tom, with his loud machinery, cut it down, and as it fell, a deep silence enveloped the forest. That night, the village was restless. We all heard it, a sorrowful, haunting wail echoing through the valley. Come morning, Tom was found at the edge of the forest. He was unharmed, but different. His once optimistic eyes were now hollow, always darting around as if expecting something lurking in the woods. All he'd say over and over was, "They watched and I saw them." After that, Tom left the village, leaving behind his dreams and that frightening reminder of the price of greed. After that incident with the logger, which, let me tell you, rattled everyone, something needed to change. Both the tribe and the settlers felt it. There was this tension in the air. No one wanted to end up like the logger, lost in his own mind after one dark night in the forest. So the tribal leaders took the initiative. They called for a meeting with the settlers. These meetings weren't common back then. This was about the land, the forest that both groups loved and depended on. In the heart of our village, under the oldest oak tree, they gathered. There was old Chief Ahanu with his deep-set eyes that seemed to know more than he let on, representing our tribe. And then there was Mr. Cartwright, the head of the settlers, a stout man who, despite his rough exterior, had respect for the tribe's beliefs. The discussions were long and at times heated, but they finally reached an agreement. Certain areas of the forest, places deemed sacred by our ancestor, would remain untouched. They'd be zones of respect, a testament to the understanding between man and the mysteries the forest held. It was a pact, sealed with the promise that as long as the zones were respected, harmony would prevail. As time marched on, things began to change. The world outside our little village was evolving. We got radio, then television, and with that, new stories and ideas began pouring in. The tales my grandmother held so close, they started to feel distant. I remember watching the younger ones, my own kids included, growing up with a different kind of beliefs. They'd often snicker or roll their eyes when I'd mention the Whisperers or any of our other tales. It wasn't just defiance, it was genuine disbelief. They'd been exposed to a world so much bigger, where old tribal stories seemed almost quaint. "It's just a story," they'd say, brushing it off as mere folklore. The reverence and respect we had for our history, for the forest, for the tales, it was eroding. Like a riverbank slowly wearing away, the foundation my grandmother had built began to crumble. We found ourselves at a crossroads where tradition and modernity clashed. When the weight of skepticism bears down, even the sturdiest of roots can start to shake. Around the time I hit my teenage years, there was this group of young lads in the village. They were the kind who thought they knew better than everyone else, always questioning the ways of the old. And as it goes, they loved to mock those ancient stories, especially when they'd had a bit too much to drink at the local tavern. One night, after they'd been particularly loud and boisterous, one of them, Joshua, started going on about how the Whisperers were just fairy tales meant to scare kids. Just shadows and imagination, he'd say, laughing. And as their courage grew, or maybe their foolishness, they hatched a plan right there and then. "Let's go into the sacred forest tonight," challenged one of them, "and come morning, we'll tell the whole village there's nothing to be afraid of." You could see it in their eyes. They genuinely believed they were about to debunk the biggest myth of our village. The rest of us at the tavern tried to dissuade them, told them it wasn't a joke, but there's a certain kind of pride in youth, isn't there? They were determined to prove everyone wrong. So with a mix of excitement and recklessness, they set off into the forest, lanterns in hand, completely unaware of what awaited them. For all the times we'd heard my grandmother's tales, nothing could have prepared us for what happened that summer. Those young men, brimming with reckless confidence, waltzed into the sacred forest, laughing and jeering at the very idea of the Whisperers. But the following dawn, as the village woke up to a dense mist, only one of them stumbled back out, his face as white as the snow-capped peaks in winter. His once jet-black hair turned stark white overnight. The spark in his eyes, gone. Instead, they were filled with a haunting emptiness, as if he'd seen the very abyss itself. Words barely escaped his lips, but when they did, they chilled our bones. He whispered about a meeting with the Whisperers, about their giant figures, about their eyes that seemed to peer right into one's soul. He talked about a warning, one that was not just for him, but for all of us. "Respect the pact," he'd murmur, "or face consequences beyond imagination." That incident changed everything. The scoffs and sneers about old tales turned into hushed respect. People began visiting my grandmother, wanting to know more, to understand, and to pay their respects. The whisperers, though unseen, felt more present than ever. It was a lesson, one we weren't likely to forget.